And then perfect. And then just to give you a sense of the format for this, I think we have an hour with you, so we'll be doing about 30 minutes of a fireside Q&A that I'll be moderating, and then we'll be opening it up to questions from the rest of us. Does that sound okay?
That's great. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. Perfect. Maybe we can start. So I'll start off with just a quick introduction about myself, and then yeah, have a bunch of questions prepared for you. And so a little bit about me. I'm Sudhanshu. I'm an EC at HBS, and I'm part of the AI club here. And this past summer, I worked at a startup called Codium, which is in the code gen space, and had studied computer science back in college. So it's a space that is very top of mind for me, and part of the reason why I'd reached out. So really, really appreciate that you took the time to do this with us. So maybe to kick things off, I guess if I could gather correctly, you graduated from HBS in 2008, just
Correct.
before the financial crisis hit. So could you take us back in time? What was it like back at HBS back then, and how did you decide that you were going to join Barclays right out of business school?
Yeah, no, absolutely. First of all, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to speak to HBS students. And, I'm sure all of you are in the thick of it in your both your RC and EC years. So a lot of fond memories of my time there. So generally speaking, yeah, I would say HBS was a very eye-opening experience for me only because I came from a, let's call it more traditional sort of business background, like many of my section mates and classmates. So studied engineering and computer engineering more specifically in my undergrad. I had gone to Cornell right after to do what is called an engineering management degree, which was sort of a bridge to technology management and that sort of thing, but less about a general management degree that we obviously all get at HBS. So my exposure at HBS were to, section mates that were just absolutely amazing and classmates who had these very, very diverse backgrounds in the context of their financial backgrounds and running companies and so on. And I, purely in the spirit of learning, because I'd been, not really exposed to how companies manage themselves from a financial standpoint, or just thinking about finance more broadly. I was just intellectually curious about, really rounding out my skill set, and post my HBS experience. Even though 2 years, I think you immerse yourself quite a bit in all the fundamentals. I just thought that learning that was important post HBS. It wasn't with the ambition of doing something necessarily to be a career banker or anything like that. It was purely in the spirit of rounding out my skill set. And I also sort of credit that to my mom, who, growing up in India, I used to play cricket fairly seriously at multiple levels, and she always encouraged me to be an all-rounder. So that has sort of stuck around in my head for a long time. So, but that's in a sports arena, or that's in business more broadly. So that's really why I entered Barclays and joined again the technology media telecom group, so covered technology companies from a vantage point of things that I knew. But it was just fascinating to learn about how companies are led, companies think about growing and scaling, and really sort of interacting with CEOs and CFOs at some of the world's most prominent Fortune 500 companies. And so that I think was a great learning experience for the 4 years that I was there.
Awesome, awesome. And out of curiosity, if not banking, do you know what else you would have done?
Yeah, probably, started, I think in your this era, I think it was going back to that time was, as I mentioned, it's mostly sort of a confidence building exercise, feeling like I had enough of a well-rounded skill set to be able to someday run something. And I think today, if I would look back and maybe put myself in your shoes, I probably wouldn't be as maybe as deliberate of in terms of how I sort of approach that. I'd probably throw a little bit more caution to the wind and basically just go into it and effectively start something, or be entrepreneurial, or join something that's earlier stage that's growing very quickly, that gives you a lot of exposure to running things pretty early on. So that's probably what I would have done in
Awesome.
retrospect.
Cool. And again, it was the financial crisis. So what was day one like for you on the job? Did a part of you wonder whether the world was melting?
I also went to college back in the early 2000s. So for me, even then, it was sort of one of these where, there's going to be cycles and ups and downs. And yes, this felt a little bit surreal. I like many of you, I'm sure, who are in your second year EC year. had, a few options post graduation, but I very deliberately chose it. I was into it, and I wanted to make sure that I wanted to give it a chance, and the folks they all encouraged us to to stay on course, and things will rebound, and that's exactly what happened. It was there was definitely a period of uncertainty, and I'm sure the environment was a little bit tough to navigate, but I think it's all good learning, right? How do you stay resilient during times of uncertainty? How do you really power through and really focus on what you're really good at, and showcase your strengths, and make your and learn as much as you can, especially if you're early in your career. So
Yeah, totally. So it sounds like you spent 4 years at Barclays, then you spent 7 years in the operating side at Rackspace,
yeah.
and then joined Stack Overflow. So I guess could you fill us in on the details? Like how does one go from graduating HBS, being a banker, to being
Yeah.
the CEO of Stack Overflow?
Yeah, no. So again, in the spirit of after 4 years, I was a VP at Barclays, and I said, it felt like, I felt quite prepared and quite exposed to a lot of the topics that I was hoping to learn, and as part of that experience. And so sort of mission accomplished in my head. And then I, spoke to a few mentors and expressed my interest to say, ultimately, this is sort of what I want to do. I want to go run something someday. And these are generally the characteristics. And they said, if you
And,
really
and,
want
and
to do that,
actually, could you tell us how you thought about running something versus,
yeah,
let's say, you could have even gone on the investing side? I think a lot of people at HBS grapple with are you
yeah.
meant to be an investor or an operator? So how did you think about that decision, if at all?
Yeah, I think that one it came down to temperament, to be honest. I think for me, my own natural inclination is to be a lot more of a doer versus sort of sitting on the sidelines to look and observe, and, and sort of advise, or I just craved a little bit more of the action of having to create. And I find, running, growing businesses to be a very creative experience. It's, navigating, it's solving problems, it's creating new value. And I just find that exciting, like motivational in many ways. So I think I discovered that, and self-discovery is a very, and self-awareness is a very sort of important uh, topic, as we're all growing in our careers. And early on, I don't think that was entirely clear, but as time went on, I realized that sitting as an advisor from the outside in, providing a bunch of advice, that may or may not be accepted or used, or maybe 10% of it or 1% of it is used, was less gratifying and rewarding than saying, look, I'm actually making things happen with my hands on the clay, that sort of thing. So it was very obvious to me that I wanted to be an operator and sort of be in the process, the creative process of building something. And that's so maybe even more than running something, it was like building something was very clear that was in my head, with perhaps the aspiration of running something someday was how I would describe it.
Got it. And how did you learn about Rackspace, and how did you
Yeah.
decide what the right first operating role was for you?
Yeah, so I looked at companies that's a couple of criteria. I was thinking about technology companies, because obviously that was my exposure throughout my career, and which I was excited about because technology really is the future and has been the future for a while, a few decades, um, and or tech enabled sort of companies. And Rackspace was actually one of the companies we covered at Barclays back then. So I'd gotten to know about the company during my experience at Barclays. And so that gave me exposure to the space. Obviously, the cloud was, a few years into its hyper growth stage. And in the context of growth, I said, okay, cloud is the area that I want to be in. So which are some high growth cloud companies that I can consider thinking about? And I sort of, came up with a few names, and Rackspace was one of them. And interestingly, out of the HBS network, it was actually run by an HBS grad, the CEO was an HBS person, and then one of the two general managers of the two large business units was also an HBS person, who was looking for a chief of staff back then. So it was, a surprise. You may be a banker and all that, but at the same time, you got to like start from the ground up if you want to learn the business. So welcome if you want to do that. And no promises, but if you do a good job, then we'll give you increasing responsibility over time, was sort of the promise. And I just took the leap. It was, definitely a pay cut and all those sort of things, but it was very much, I felt inherently sort of, or intrinsically motivated to go do it. So I was like, let's go make it happen.
Awesome. So it seems like you spent about 7 years there,
Yeah.
quite a long time. How did you get the call to be CEO of Stack Overflow? I'm assuming this is not one of those things where you drop in a resume and apply online.
Right. Yeah.
How did they find you for this opportunity, and why did they pick you?
Yeah, it's a good question for the folks who reached out. I think that ultimately, if I were to guess, it is probably based on the work that I'd done at Rackspace and what the company at Stack Overflow needed when they were at this inflection point in 2018, 2019. So the work I'd done at Rackspace was mostly leading some high growth businesses at the company, including the what we call third party cloud businesses or managed public clouds business focused on Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud, and helping build a technology services business to help companies leverage those cloud platforms, either coming from traditional managed hosting infrastructure or any other sort of form factor that they were part of, maybe their own data centers, et cetera. So growing that business very rapidly, where it became effectively the primary growth engine of the company Rackspace, which then allowed it to go public, soon after. And having done that and that experience of, truly was a huge pivot for Rackspace as a company because it was going from competing with the cloud providers to partnering with them and really building a business off of that. So that experience, I'm assuming, caught people's attention, and through a series of let's call it fortunate events, and through networks and the VC networks, and just making sure people knew who I was, and those sort of things just came together, and they were running a process, and I was part of that process, and went through multiple months and multiple sets of sessions with the board and all those sort of things that you'd expect, and was very fortunate to get the role. So that's how it transpired.
Awesome. You make it sound simple, but I'm sure there's a lot that went into that. Um, I'm curious now, I guess switching gears a little bit, for folks in the audience who maybe don't know as much about Stack Overflow and what the business does, could you articulate the business as how you see it?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So Stack Overflow is the world's largest software developer community and platform. So we serve about 100 million people all around the world. And the reason why we exist is to make sure that the world's developers have this collective knowledge of now, which is 60 million questions and answers on every possible technology topic that has been contributed by these community members for over 16 years. And so that platform with all this knowledge is incredibly valuable for developers to get unstuck when they have issues writing code. And that's been very much a foundational reference for folks over the past decade and a half. So that's the foundation of the company. It was created by two amazing founders who were technologists back in 2008. And the business model of the company, effectively, you can think of it in three pieces. The first piece is around advertising. It makes sense considering we have such large traffic. We're one of the most popular websites in the world. Was the first business model that continues to be our oldest business line, which continues to progress. The second business was one that I came on to really scale, which is the enterprise business back in 2019. And that is effectively a private version, enterprise version of this platform that companies use to share similar knowledge within companies, because that's also a very important use case, because people want to effectively use their internal community of experts and subject matter experts to really document and make sure they have their most accurate information inside their companies that they can leverage for all their people. And that has been a very fast-growing business over the past few years, and that is very much a SaaS business. And our third business line, most recently through the AI wave, because of all this amazing information that we have on the public platform, and the fact that thousands of questions are asked on the platform every week, we have begun now to partner with AI companies and cloud companies so they can use all this knowledge to train their foundation models and do things like RAG and indexing and other AI use case specific topics. And they leverage this both in the context of not only licensing the existing information, but also getting access to the fresh content that's generated on the site on an ongoing basis. So this creates what we call a knowledge as a service loop, which allows all these developer tools, including the one that you worked at, Sudhanshu, to make sure that wherever the developers are, we're able to make sure they're able to ask questions seamlessly on our platform from those tools. And for example, yesterday we announced our partnership with GitHub Copilot that went public, where now people are generating code in GitHub Copilot, and Stack Overflow content is being referenced right in GitHub Copilot, so that if they have questions about the code generation that's been produced, they can highlight it and get really deep context and attributed context back to the source data. So that is, so in summary, platform of community, 100 million, 60 million questions and answers. On top of that, ads, enterprise SaaS, and now a data API business that we built out over time.
Awesome. Makes sense. And I was a devout user of Stack Overflow, and especially when I was in college. And I worked as an engineer a few summers, one at Uber, once at the New York Times. And like whenever I was stuck, like the only way I could find an answer was, my instinct would be to go to Stack Overflow. But obviously now the world has changed a lot. Now when I'm stuck, I need to debug some code, I just ask ChatGPT, or I use a GitHub Copilot or a Codium, and most times I get the answers I'm looking for, because previously with Stack Overflow, you would hope someone asked a similar enough question to the one that you have, and then you have to then do the work to apply that to your situation.
Right.
Now with LLMs, it's almost like magic. You just paste your code, you paste your error logs, and it just fixes it for you. So I'm curious, how has the world of things like ChatGPT and Copilots changed the user base and the way users are using Stack Overflow?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's been a huge impact. Clearly, we're in sort of this new tectonic shift in the industry, and so this is here to stay. So this next wave is indisputable. So it's a very exciting time in many ways, because it sort of redefines how we think about, to your point. It is quite magical when you think about the possibilities of the future, especially if you project out a little bit in the future, because I think there's still going to be an adoption curve, and there's always the balancing of where the technology is at, how it's being leveraged, how extensively it's being leveraged by, let's say, companies and institutions, and more ones with heavy regulations, etc. But you're right that it is absolutely a very, very huge wave. So in the context of the difference in how developers access the platform, so you've got, if you think about sort of the layer of the AI stack, you've got at the bottom of, you obviously have the chip layer with the companies like NVIDIA, et cetera, that are obviously in the news. You then right above that have the cloud environments, so the AWSs and the Googles and the Microsofts, and they clearly are the beneficiaries also. If you keep going up, the next layer up is effectively the foundation model producers, right, who are the OpenAIs of the world and anybody else that you can imagine. If you blow out what that foundational model layer actually needs, there's a very, very obvious category, which is effectively data and AI infrastructure. So our view is that we are a fundamental and must-have category in there, which is what we're calling a knowledge store or knowledge as a service, which is effectively a high-quality knowledge base that ultimately helps train these LLM models, because they're only as good as the knowledge that's being produced and the data that's going into training these models. So for us, we have discovered that our mission, generally speaking, of empowering the world to build technology through collective knowledge, is also operating from a financial sense. We're providing the sort of substrate to make sure that the AI industry keeps going forward. And we're literally one out of maybe 4 large data sources that LLM models train on. The other ones will be Reddit and maybe Wikipedia, and then there's us, and there's like obviously a very long tail beyond that with all the the media publishers and so on that you can think of. But we're literally one of the biggest corpuses of information. We have something like 20 to 30 billion tokens of information on the platform with 16 million questions and answers. So, and then again, with very fresh data being produced on a daily basis. So that very specific place is where we'd like to operate. So that's at a core level in the ecosystem. Beyond that, based on the behavioral change that you're describing, what we have decided to do is, rather than get everybody to come to Stack Overflow through, let's say, a Google search, Sudhanshu, was likely how you came to us when you encountered an issue. Clearly, search and AI are now somewhat interchangeable. Even today, ChatGPT launched its own search function or search capability, you'll see. So if that's the case, then we just want to be wherever the developers are. If they're in ChatGPT or Codium or Google Gemini or any of these places, we want to be in all of them, or GitHub, as an example, GitHub Copilot. So meaning we want to surface our content wherever the developer is in any of their AI tools. We also not only want to surface it, we want to enable them to ask questions on our platform from any of these places, directly from those places. And what that allows us to do is, one, create a corpus of data that everybody benefits from in an open sense. And all these companies can leverage it to keep promoting the quality of their models, and they get more advanced over time. So we're never losing the user. If you still have an issue, even in an advanced scenario, you're able to ask a question on Stack. The community is able to curate, upvote, downvote, all the things that you're exposed to, and make sure the quality of that information is really high, as it's always been on Stack Overflow. We're not a forum. We're very much a really, really high quality knowledge base. And that's supremely useful for LLM training. So that allows the circle of life to continue, because these LLM models are gaining from this new content being produced. We obviously construct commercial relationships with all these AI companies, so that way, we're able to invest in our platform and our community, and the world keeps going around. So we're effectively adapting to a change in the developer workflow, where if they're moving towards AI tools, no problem, we'll show up there, and we'll work with AI companies to power what they're actually producing for those developers.
Yeah. I guess to double click on the data question, a few questions I had is like, one, like I agree, there's a ton of valuable data on Stack Overflow today. But if you were to say license all of that data to a foundation model company, like what will make them come back the next year? You need more data that is continually generated.
Yeah.
And at least previously, I would have imagined there's this nice two-sided marketplace, right? Where the experts are on Stack Overflow, the developers know that's the place to ask the questions. But now when developers may not ask every question on Stack Overflow, maybe the experts feel less incentivized to be on Stack Overflow. So how do you create that data flywheel going? How do you incentivize questions being asked and answered?
Yeah. I think the inherent, we talk a lot about this in terms of the intrinsic versus extrinsic motivations for people, I think for developers specifically. So what is interesting is that the intrinsic motivations have always sort of stayed the same. Developers, you could even ask, like, why does Stack Overflow even exist? Why did it even get created back in 2008? A common question I used to get very early on in my tenure is like, do you pay the community to go and answer every question and so on? And the answer is no, because this is the spirit in which this has all been done. It's been done in the spirit of helping fellow developers solve problems. So in that context, that's an intrinsic motivation. They're helping as a function of that. They're getting some extrinsic rewards. As an example, recognition as the world's best JavaScript programmer. People often showcase their profiles when they're getting hired into their new job. Look how I've actually contributed to the community. In the similar to open source ecosystems. So all of that is very, very, very much the reason why people are on the platform or have been on the platform. Going forward, imagine every time you can go, by the way, with our partnerships with ChatGPT and Google Gemini, which we have already announced publicly, and we've got several others that we've done, but not even announced publicly, is that if you go into ChatGPT and say, how do I do, let's say, spin up an AWS EC2 instance, you will get an answer from ChatGPT, but you click on sources, you will see the links to Stack Overflow in the source list. Every time that happens, where an answer is being produced, our goal is to make sure that the original person that contributed to that ChatGPT answer is getting recognized. So the fact is that, let's say there are thousands and millions of new people showing up in these new AI tools, the next generation of programmers, et cetera. Again, the same inherent or the intrinsic motivation is we're effectively focused on that to say, look, your answer has impacted 2 million people. And whether that happened through ChatGPT or that happened through our platform or some other place is somewhat irrelevant. It's just that we want you to know that you had a big impact on the world. And that's what we're centered around. So again, irrespective of the user interface and where people do it, or maybe let's call it the search interface or whatever term you'd like to use, we just want to make sure that the knowledge is high quality and we continuously keep moving up the quality and we capture the world's knowledge. Because AI tools will have a complexity cliff, even though most of the cases you're getting answers, they will tap out at some point. And so we need to be sort of the central place where that's collected and curated over time.
Fascinating. Okay, so it sounds like really tapping into the developer ethos of recognition, being recognized as one of the world's expert is a key pillar that a lot of engagement in Stack Overflow still rests on. I guess maybe one final question from me before I open it up. I guess if you have the data, if you have the secret sauce, like why not build your own code foundation model or build an end-to-end code model and Copilot? How do you think about where you should be playing and where you shouldn't be playing?
Yeah, there are certain aspects. What I didn't mention is we have also integrated generative AI in a whole bunch of our areas, including on the public platform in our enterprise product. We launched something called Overflow AI, which are effectively natural language capabilities that sit on top of the corpus of data that we have on the public platform, as well as all our customers, the 20,000 customers that have the private enterprise version of Stack Overflow, all the banks, et cetera. So the idea is to make sure that they're able to leverage the best of this technology in the context of their knowledge base that's rooted in high quality knowledge, either on our platform, on the public or in the private case. And that is, it's sort of a default now. It's going to be the expectation in this next era is like, companies are either AI first or they've leveraged AI, they've got AI features integrated into their SaaS platforms, as an example. The reason why we chose not to go down the path of let's say an OpenAI or anybody else, and so go and have our own LLM model, et cetera. I think that's a somewhat of a different proposition and different problem to solve. I think and where they operate in the layer of the AI stack, I think is very specific. We believe our core competence and our strength as a company, if you think about it, it's like it's community, it's all this collective knowledge that could power a lot of different things. It could power learning, it could power LLM models, it could power awareness and so on. And that I think is really where we want to focus. We don't want to go down what could be a fairly expensive proposition of going and building out an equivalent to an OpenAI. And as you see, it's not inexpensive to build any of these companies out.
Totally. Awesome. Maybe with that, we can open it up for questions in the audience. I guess, two requests I would have is if you're in the audience, maybe turn on your camera so Prashanth knows he's not talking to a bunch of blank screens. And
No,
then
it could be these could be AI agents. You never know if these are really
yes, at least one non-human on this call.
Yeah.
Cool. If you have a question, maybe you can do the raise hand feature, and then I can maybe call on your name and you can jump in with your question. Anyone raising their hand?
I'm still looking for the raise hand feature, but can I ask a question? First of all, thanks so much for being here. This is super interesting. As a Stack Overflow user, I also worked at Code Academy for a bit, so this is fun and relevant from that perspective. One thing I'm curious about, in part from that experience, is we had, like Stack Overflow does, a very active and opinionated community and had the challenges of managing a forum. And so you mentioned the moderators in passing, but as you think about being a knowledge base, like that community and maintaining that community's personality and culture and ensuring they're bought into Stack Overflow strategy seems pretty important to having that continue to be such an accurate source of knowledge. So I'm curious, as you're like plotting this new vision, making all these transitions, introducing new products, how you are working with the community to bring them along on that journey.
Yeah, and it's really, really astute question, and one that will come from somebody who is deep in it. Like if you were at Code Academy, I appreciate that question for sure. So you're right that all of this starts with the community, and that's the central theme. So in terms of moderators, this is a tremendous sort of period of change, just generally speaking, right? The industry has completely changed. The mission of how we operate with this knowledge base and what it actually serves. We've added now a huge new additional use case that nobody even sort of anticipated. So that comes with a lot of communication with this core group and how we actually engage. So there's, admittedly a lot of work on that front to do because it is a huge change. There's a kind of a very large number of people, about 100 million people, and they're all sort of in different levels of acceptance around this, whether this is hype all the way to, yes, this is like the next thing to slice bread to anything in between. So I think there's absolutely a change management process. We have an excellent VP of community who's former Reddit, former Wikipedia person that I really sort of have him on my senior leadership team. And so I partner closely with him to make sure that we bring along the community, but it's a big part of our go forward plans. We've been trying to determine ultimately where do we operate, what is our true vision, and now that we've determined that, now and a lot of that came from the input from the community, but it has to now be reinforced constantly, especially given the scale of the people that we deal with. And it's an easier said than done sort of a task, because there's going to be a lot of opinions about changing the mission, or whether this is in fact changing the mission. What the original sort of motivations that people came together to fulfill, is that changing? This is a new world that they may or may not want to participate in. So there's a lot of definitely debates, and these are fairly public debates, but we have to ultimately on the margin do the right thing for the overall community's benefit. Because this is a change that's going to be here to stay, and it's one of those things. Staying constant and not doing anything about it is actually definitely not going to work. So it is a challenge, probably the biggest challenge, I would say, to all the things I was talking to Sudhanshu about. This question, MB, that you're asking is probably the most challenging.
I think Amir, you have a question.
Yes, I do. Hi, thanks so much for being here, and thanks, Sudhanshu, for organizing this. My question is more on the personal side and sort of the career growth side. As somebody who's had an experience in sort of the more technical education and then sort of the more non-technical roles in the industry, I'm wondering how did you reason about the sort of the technical and non-technical sides that you acquired throughout your career? And sort of in simplified terms, oftentimes technical folks have to decide whether they take the CEO or the CTO path. And so I was wondering, how do you reason about that? Thanks.
Yeah, it was mostly, I go back to the point that I made earlier, which is I've always wanted to be quote unquote an all-rounder. So I've gravitated towards, I would say, let's call it non-specialist roles, which are not super, I don't think I would have ever had the temperament to be a CTO, right? You're super, super deep in the tech. So for me, it's just, I think I just find it more intellectually curious and more of a creative exercise to bring all the pieces together to drive building new products and driving growth at the same time through revenue, being in front of customers, understand what they care about, how do we strategically position the company, and then ultimately, of course, how do you financially succeed? So all of that is a lot more interesting for me. So so it's a little bit of I don't know if it's typical or atypical, but certainly that's the path I've taken. Certainly, perhaps the more typical path in Silicon Valley is somebody who's come from, let's say, a product-oriented role and has sort of made their way, or have come from a, let's say, go-to-market background, run sales teams, and effectively, come up that way. And the most classic example of this could be maybe Steve Ballmer and maybe Satya Nadella, right? So that is what's typical. I think I've just sort of gone with what really works for me, which is to be a little bit of a generalist, or at least a deep generalist, if that even makes sense. But that is how I've approached it.
And Prashanth, maybe one follow-up. As a generalist, how did you figure out where you wanted to excel at? I think a lot of, for example, my classmates, they were looking for internships this past summer, and unfortunately, being an HBS MBA intern is not the best value proposition in the Valley right now.
Right. Yeah.
How did you think about, okay, if you're an engineer, it's kind of clear where to excel, but if you're just a generalist and an all-rounder, how did you think about where your superpowers were?
Yeah, sometimes, it's funny, the HBS piece, and there's always the HBS Stanford comparison, but I would say, I wouldn't be too critical about it, but only because I think it comes down to like an intersection. There's a few Venn diagrams. There's a really good book called Ikigai. I don't know if that's the exact title of the book, but it's a Japanese concept, at least, which effectively talks about the intersection of what you're really good at, what you're passionate about, what the world is going to pay for, what the big problems that people are trying to solve. So that intersection, there's a little bit of an art and a science to figuring out. The science part is people like Tim Butler at HBS, who I remember in my first year, he's RC year, he did this really great exercise. I don't know if he still does this at the school, but it's really sort of you're able to really understand what your strengths are, based on your motivations and ultimately what you're most geared up to do. So I think it takes a fair amount of self-reflection to know what you're really good at, where you excel, getting, third external feedback about, what people perceive you as, making sure there isn't a sort of a cognitive dissonance between those two things. And so then I think, and then marrying that with all the other things I just rattled off. And I think is the exercise that I would recommend all of you to do before you kind of embark on your first post HBS career, and just be very thoughtful about it, which I'm sure all of you are. But the internship between your RC and EC years is a way to, one, test your hypotheses around that topic, and then number two is to also sort of eliminate. Because oftentimes it's not like it may not be entirely true for one thing to stand out is saying I absolutely just want to go do that thing because you have that high conviction. If you do have that high of a conviction, then you should just go do it because that makes sense. But if you're in the process of eliminating many things and okay, I want to go to a big company or maybe a high growth smaller company, go do one of them and then figure out whether that's engaging, and then then you have the option value after you graduate to choose the other way if you found out otherwise. So that's my advice.
Yeah. I think Malika, you had a question?
Yep, sure. Firstly, Prashanth, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
Switching gears a little bit, I think my question is, do you foresee like maybe not like in a few years, a universe where you don't have software engineers and it's just the AI bot who are essentially coding for you? And if yes, where do you see like Stack Overflow sort of featuring in that scenario, and how do you think can Stack Overflow contribute to such a future?
Yeah, no, great question. I get this question, Malika, about the future of software developers quite a bit, and I will tell you that if anything, this current moment in time means that there are actually going to be a lot more. Let's call them software developers. I'll put them in quotes just for a second, but I will say there's going to be a lot more than there are going to be fewer. And here there are a few reasons for it. One is if you look at history and you look at the number of developers over time, I'll give you whether that's the BPO era, a lot of jobs were going to India as an example, or other emerging markets, or there was this era in the 2010s, which is all about automate all the things, through DevOps and just in general. All that suggested that you're getting a lot more productivity by sending, let's call it lower level tasks to other places, whether it's to the code or to other people, to ultimately, then why do you need so many developers, to go do things? So that's one. During that time, what we've noticed is actually the number of developers actually just exploded, during that time. So it's somewhat counterintuitive, only because as those tasks have been sent and other places have been automated away, there's just been more and more software to write. They have more time to go write new software because it just progresses the world. Software and technology is not going to sort of end in 2024, right? We're just in very, very early innings around exploring what the potential of code and of software is. So it's just absolutely, it is on a secular uptrend for the sort of to infinity. So in terms of the amount of software that's going to be written, it's going to be new types of things that need to be created. Another example would be, for example, as the AI sort of wave is embarked, it may, and then at the same time, the economic point around doing more with less, productivity coming to the forefront. So larger companies, even today, you saw Intel, they've cut tens of thousands of jobs second time in a year, and that suggests that companies are getting a lot fitter, which is a good thing because you're basically taking a lot of let's call it fat out. At the same time, there are hundreds and thousands of new companies being created, right? So AI, there's tons of dollars being tossed into the ecosystem. New startups are emerging. What are all these startups doing? They're building new software. They're building the piece parts for the AI ecosystem to thrive, or even Sudhanshu's summer internship company, as an example, would not have existed if the AI wave did not come around. So there may be less software developers, or maybe the explosion of software developers within a company may not accelerate like the way it used to, let's say, during the COVID era or during the ZERP era, but the number of software developers in aggregate across both existing and new companies that get created will absolutely increase, only because there's going to be so much more to go do, and it'll just get distributed across many more entities versus it being concentrated in a few, is sort of my prediction. So yes, will it be odd? Maybe the third part of your question, a lot of the tasks that developers perform today will get absolutely the sort of the boring parts of the job will get automated away, and to the magic that Sudhanshu was talking about, that's going to be very apparent. That's going to be the new way to write code. It's like, doing math without the calculator. Like, why would you do it if you had access to one, right? So you would absolutely leverage it, and that will just mean that developers, quote unquote, will be able to do a lot more, and they will not be focused on let's call it lower level tasks, and much of that will be abstracted away, much like software development is looking to abstract away as much of the lower level items. It's been doing that for decades. It started with assembly code, and now here we are sitting abstracting with generative AI. So that's just going to keep continuing.
Awesome. I think Ashka had a question.
Yes, thank you. Hi, it's great to meet you, and thank you so much for being here. It was really great hearing about your experiences and takes on the industry. I was curious, as an HBS alum, how did your time at HBS shape how you thought about leadership, particularly as you moved into the CEO role?
Yeah.
And as a follow-up to that, what do you recommend we focus on while we're here in the next year or two?
Yeah, really great question. I would say, if I were to think back, it's often talked about during business school, but people say it all comes down to the people, and how you lead people, manage people, bring the most out of people, make sure that the best parts of them shine, and they solve big problems. I can tell you without a shred of doubt that that's absolutely true, because I don't necessarily remember a lot of the like the fundamentals are the fundamentals, you better remember them. But like there's a lot of stuff in between there, which are somewhat context dependent and time dependent. And they quickly, in the spirit of like time moves, and, the industry moves so quickly that you're learning very much on the job. A lot of it is what you're learning about the practical nature of how companies are run. And a lot of that, when you boil it down, comes down to how do you actually work with people and how do you lead people. And that happens at various levels. So I'll give you an example. It's easier, or maybe different. It's not easier. It's different to run let's say a deal team in a private equity sense, or let's say a banking team, or running a consulting team of, your associate analyst and VP and so on, and doing that for a client. And then there's a different experience running like 300, 400, 600, 1,000 people. And how do you do that where you motivate them, work through challenges, navigate external factors, navigate internal factors? It just takes a very, very different skill set, and there's no substitution to doing it, really, right? So before my time at Rackspace, I'd never really led a team of, more than maybe like 20 people, right? And I don't know if that's probably the case for many of the HBSers when you're graduating. So I think having that experience of when you lead a large number of people, I think it comes with different expectations and skills that either you may have inherently, that you may have to develop or sharpen. So it's just, I think my biggest advice would be to be open-minded, think about a lifelong journey of learning, not just based on traditional sort of classroom learning, but actually learning by doing. So whatever you are interested in, I would sort of make sure that you absolutely experience it and don't take any shortcuts, because the earlier you actually do that, the earlier you make those mistakes, let's say making the wrong hire, leading the wrong way, etc., the better you're going to be much later on, because you're going to have practical life experience of having done that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Kenny?
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. This has been really great. So I guess my question is, you mentioned about how, of course, with Gen AI, there's just going to be so much more code out there, so many more companies that are going to build great things. So I'm curious about your takes on these companies that are basically trying to control for, all of this code generation from AI, but like humans still need to understand in order to maintain a code. Some companies are trying to use AI in order to sort of crack the maintenance part. And I guess my question really is around, like, I saw your SaaS product, in my understanding at least, and I could be wrong, it seems more kind of like a documentation explainability method. I'm curious what your thoughts are if people are going to push into the space of automating sort of the maintenance portion of coding, who will be the winners and what specific things will they get right that the losers won't?
Yeah, you've got a couple of different inherent questions in there, but I think it's generally speaking, the direction of travel is to leverage AI and generative AI to automate even more of the tasks in the workflow of the developer, right? So including, for example, searching and finding information in your workflow. So even our SaaS product as an example, rather than having people go in and actually answer a question that a fellow person has got in a fellow sort of employee in their company has got, we are automatically answering those questions through, for example, our Slack and Microsoft Teams integration. So in some of that could be AI powered, where it actually serves up a answer that is, what it sort of is summarizing and inferring based on all the other sort of knowledge that exists in the company on the platform. So the spirit is always, how do you make it absolutely seamless? How do you make sure that even the maintenance pieces are actually, they're all craft and they're just, we're taking those away. And in many ways, the early versions of our product was to solve that problem pre-generative AI. And now it's about, okay, how do we leverage generative AI to even accelerate, much of that same mission, and solve things like the empty stadium problem. Like when people buy software, you come in and you're just waiting for, content to be there, or you're waiting for people to engage there. And there's a lot of, software that just sort of collects dust in companies. And this all allows, with generative AI, allows us to sort of really push the ball forward on all those topics in a big way, because it allows us to supercharge using AI, engagement, network effects, grab information from multiple places, serve it up in a kind of 80% type of form to accelerate content generation, and even prompting people who are experts to then sort of go and curate that and keep the world moving forward. I'll give you another example, slightly orthogonal to your question, but on the public platform, any of you that view StackOverflow, MB, Sudhanshu, Kenny, maybe you've done it, and it would be, we've always had a reputation of having it's a little bit of a tough place to ask a question, because the standard's pretty high, and so people get slapped on the wrist all the time. And so that was my first experience when I used StackOverflow, ironically. And now we actually have this area called Staging Ground, which is powered by generative AI, which actually allows an AI assistant question asking experience, where if you ask a question that is in fact a duplicate, or has been asked by somebody else, it's telling you that in a sort of private way, versus you sort of getting the public retribution for doing that. So we're doing that in a way to sort of leverage AI to solve fundamental problems that any of these sort of workflows we're trying to solve originally. And how do we do that very effectively? I know I sort of went slightly differently relative to your question, but I want to make sure that I shared that also in that context.
Prashanth, one question I had for you, slightly unrelated. I'm curious, would you still recommend someone to get an MBA today? Depends on your objective, I suppose. I think if you're a career switcher, yes, I'd probably still recommend it. If you are, probably the biggest thing also is, of course, access to a very large network that I think is, I think it's huge, and an excellent high quality network that I think you will likely leverage throughout your career. So I don't know about an MBA more generally. I would say an MBA from HBS, yes, for sure, at least for that second reason. The first reason around career switching, if it's at a top school, yes, I'd still recommend it. Is it necessary if you are already in a certain field and you're looking to sort of go and start something? Probably not. Maybe it just sort of depends on your what you feel like you're lacking to go do that. Because if you're a technology founder, if you are a technologist, if you're a product person, if you're you can probably go start something pretty easily. There's a lot accessible to you. And even HBS gives you a lot of resources, even outside of the traditional MBA program, to be able to, scale up that way. But yeah, for those other reasons, I would say yes, at HBS. And you alluded to this a little bit, which is, you said maybe if you were in our shoes today, maybe you wouldn't have gone into banking. You might start a company right away, or join a startup. Can you walk us through a little bit more of that rationale, which is, let's say someone wants to be in your shoes 15 years from now, CEO of a software company. What should they be doing right out of HBS today to best prepare themselves for that role? Yeah, so that it's another question. It's interesting, right? Like HBS folks are generally goal oriented, and that just, I think, is probably a commonality between a lot of people here. People are ambitious, people are successful, people generally go towards the direction that they're aiming for, or go and achieve great things.
The question, I think, is like really aligning what you're inherently deep down want to do with your time, on this earth, with your profession. I think that as long as that, a simpler way of saying that is aligned with your passion. But I think I would really encourage all of you to sort of align yourself around that versus following the herd, which is a tendency, generally speaking, in my observation at HBS. People all want to go it's not a coincidence that there's a certain career that's always the hot career for the year, right? And it happens every 5 years. It's like a new hot thing. During our time, it was private equity and hedge funds. In your time, it's tech companies and entrepreneurship. In 5 years, it'll be something else. There may be an AI bubble that bursts in the next couple of years, and then it would be similar to the financial crisis back in 2008. So what you don't want to do is just sort of keep following kind of wherever the sort of the news is trending. But I would really look to be introspective about what you really care to do with your life, and generally take a step in that direction, whatever that is. The best step forward would sort of be my advice. And so if you have that clarity, then I think it'll guide you pretty much in terms of like how you get there. You'll ask all the right questions to people like me who are a few years out, and be able to sort of progress in that way.
And specifically, what about starting a company like from your vantage point right now seems appealing to you? Like that's something you mentioned you might have considered doing if you were an HBS.
Yeah. And so for me, again, this is a very personal point around, what engages me versus somebody else. But for me, I think the process of building something, the creative process of bringing something to life, I think is quite exciting and rewarding and engaging. And it's a great way for me to spend my time. So I think in that context, and it obviously, I believe it aligns with my own strengths. So for me, it's that intersection with that Ikigai concept that I mentioned previously. I think it's the fastest way to exercise those creative muscles and to be able to build something right in front of your own eyes, fairly quickly. And it's never been easier to start a company, right? Whether that happened like almost a decade ago, it became really easy to start a company. But nowadays, you don't need to necessarily have, to Malika's question, an army of engineers to go and do things. You could probably get going with prototyping. You can probably get an MVP going pretty quickly. So even if you're just curious to find out whether your idea has any merit, there's no excuse, because like you can probably get that done. So that's the thing. Like if you have an idea, a lot of ideas, there are all sorts of crass sayings about that. Many people have ideas, but it's all down to whether or not you put that to work and execute and make it real. So today, making an idea real is as easy as ever been. So I think that's the advantage.
Yeah. Well, so there are a bunch of aspiring startup founders on this call. Maybe to put you on the spot, is there a problem or thing you wish someone solved for you that you wish a startup founder popped up with a demo in your office with?
Ooh, wow. Okay, that's an interesting question. And the problems, I think, in the context of the AI world, I think there are a few that probably come to mind. If you think about the bottlenecks of what exists today, like if I go back to that earlier analogy around chips and infrastructure and LLM models and data, I think typically there's a saying about like your margin is my opportunity kind of point. So I think there's this question about, okay, clearly NVIDIA is a great company and it's, well in the lead. It's like, probably a decade ahead of most other companies. But that's an area, like if you have one company dominating like that entire space, that suggests that, and you're able to charge obviously a premium for that, and those are quite expensive, then I think that poses an opportunity. Because I think if you unlock that, a lot more people have access to chips that ultimately power AI applications. I think that changes the game. So that's one sort of vantage point, I would say. The other place that I would say is that as the arrow keeps going up the stack, the place that's probably least explored is the application layer. So all the traditional sort of incumbent SaaS providers that you can think of have all got, they're trying to incorporate AI or integrate AI rather into their tools, but having AI first applications which there's basically sort of a complete blue ocean on that, is, I think you can absolutely go after that. And I think there's literally any vertical you can think of, you can reimagine. So I think there's that Cambrian explosion that people have been talking about. I think that's really what is in front of everyone. So if you have, let's say, a distinct background that gives you an edge, somebody here may be like MB, she comes from Code Academy, deep ed tech background. How can you reimagine ed tech with an AI first tutor, as an example, but founded based on the same sort of fundamental principles, the same problems that we're trying to solve, but with new technology. So I think those sort of both at the chip layer as well as at the application layer, that's probably where I would point you to for those reasons.
Awesome. I know we have a couple of minutes left, so maybe I'll toss a few rapid fire questions. I'd love to hear your gut responses.
Okay.
So maybe question number one, what was your favorite class at HBS and why?
Ooh, okay. It was managing human capital. For much of the reasons we talked about in this class, also in this session. It's all about like leading people. What would you do if you were in this situation? Would you fire the person? Would you not fire the person? This person is a quandary. Who's at fault? All that kind of stuff. It's like exercising judgment. It was probably one of the, people talk about soft classes and hard classes. I found that to be especially, it gives you as close of a view of the real life as, as I remember it. So.
Cool. Question two, something you learned about AI in the recent months that surprised you?
Wow. Well, I think we talked about our own business. I think we were really surprised about the reliance of LLM models on our data. That came as, I'll tell you the exact moment we realized that. As soon as we went from realizing that the internet was going from an open internet to a closed internet, we put up all the anti-scrapers and we blocked people from scraping our site. We got a bunch of inbounds from a bunch of people saying, look, we need your data to be able to train our models. And we were quite surprised by the names that approached us and the number of companies that approached us. Yeah.
Awesome. Most challenging thing about being a CEO?
I think it's certainly in this company, there's somewhat of a unique situation. Most companies have, you've got your employees, you've got your customers, you've got your investors, and that's sort of somewhat expected, and you're exposed to that throughout your career. For me as a CEO, it's the fourth element of managing a community of about 100 million people. This is, again, MB's question of like how you bring along moderators. That is an underestimated task, especially with a company like this. So managing not only like the three parts that you'd expect to manage, but this extra element, which is a little bit of a very much a core part of the company, but has such a high beta in terms of how it could affect you, I think is definitely been the biggest challenge for me personally.
Cool. And then last question, fast bowling or spin bowling?
Neither. Wicket keeping and opening batsman. Yes.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, so you must love Dhoni then.
Yes.
Awesome. Cool. We're at time. Any parting thoughts? Thank you so much, Prashanth, again for doing this. I'm sure everyone really enjoyed it, but yes, any closing thoughts? And that's our session.
Yeah, no, look, I really wish you all the best. It's going to be an amazing future for you folks. You're entering during a time of, it's an absolute explosion of creativity and excitement, and tech is going to be central. So you're graduating, or you're a year away from graduating during a very, very exciting period in human history. So I would just say, lean into it, be part of it, be curious. Just know that you're never going to know enough, including, this goes for people like me, like, the amount of information we have to consume to keep up is quite staggering based on the amount of developments that happen on a daily basis. So just adopt a lifelong learner mentality and be fearless and take chances and go for it. And you'll be surprised what comes out on the other end.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Prashanth. Thank you, everyone.
You got it. Thank you, everybody. All the best.